and good afternoon to those who are joining from the Caribbean. My name is Donna Minot Cates, head of the Department of Chemistry at the University of the West Indies Mona campus and the moderator of today's seminar. Ladies and gentlemen, as the University of the West Indies celebrates its 75th anniversary, rooted, ready, rising, it is a distinct honor on behalf of the Faculty of Science and Technology on the Mona campus in Jamaica to welcome you to yet another session in the lecture series, The Professor Speaks, as we today let the research speak for itself. Today's seminar is a collaborative effort and is brought to you by the Faculty of Science and Technology at the University of the West Indies Mona, along with the University of Leeds, University of Sheffield, GEMS Executive Coaching, and the Black Female Academics Network in the United Kingdom. In considering the work of Black female academics, there was so much academic bounty to digest that we were unable to limit the presentations to one day. And so this is part one of a two-part series. The second part will be presented in late May, and we ask you to look out for that. This event will serve to inform global audiences of Black female academics' work, their research interests and research areas, and the pioneering work at the professorial and senior research leadership levels in the UK, Africa, and the Caribbean. It will address prevalent issues confronting Black academics by providing a space for them to present successful academic work and reflect on their current career approaches. Today we present not just one, but 6 accomplished women of color, senior researchers from the United Kingdom, Africa, and the Caribbean. They will take us through some aspects of their research journey. And so I welcome our presenters, Professor Lisa Dion Morris, Dr. Yoselin Benitez Alfonso, Dr. Winnie Bedigen, and Dr. Sally Asay Appiah, all of the University of Leeds, as well as our own Professor Mona Webber and Professor Tanisha Stevenson of the University of the West Indies. After introductions, our presenters will each give a mini talk for 10 minutes, which will be immediately followed by a brief question and answer session. You are asked to raise your questions in the chat for the presenters to consider. We look forward to an engaging session as we let the research speak for itself, celebrating the accomplishments of female professors and senior female academics in the UK, Africa, and the Caribbean. Ladies and gentlemen, our first speaker will be Professor Lisa Dion Morris. As Professor Morris shares her screen, I will introduce her. Professor Morris, you may go ahead and share. Thank you, Professor Morris. Professor Lisa Dion Morris operates in the research space of the Institute of Design, Robotics, and Optimization, Her area of interest is design science, which includes engineering design, industrial design, policy, capability-driven design, product design, information learning, manufacturing and production, health system security, and medical design. Lisa Dion is a celebrated UK female STEM professor, founder of the Black Female Academics Network, and an executive career and leadership coach with expertise and substantial experience in change and transformation. Lisa Dion brings this to her executive coaching industry and academic practice when partnering with leaders to facilitate and enable change, real change that is purposeful, meaningful, inclusive, and sustainable. Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome Professor Lisa Dion Morris.
Thank you. I would like to say good afternoon, good evening to all who are present today. I would like to start by introducing myself. My name is Professor Lisa Dion Morris, and I sit within the School of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Leeds. My talk is focused on human activity and product design development, systems and services, but it's really focused on the idea of designing and researching for best fit. As I said before, through my research and my research activities, that my focus is specifically on upliftment, responding to the needs of marginalized communities, and most importantly, moving from design conception to transformation through leadership. I did a part-time PhD whilst working in industry, whilst lecturing at the University of Leeds, which has given me great insight into societal responses, as well as the need for research output. When I started my career, I wanted to be able to describe who was in the room. So I came up with a personal challenge statement. My personal challenge statement goes beyond my discipline, but actually speaks into the area of research that I would like to be known for. So my focus is delivering new products, systems, and services which demonstrably support marginalized communities, older adults, people with disabilities, as well as the wider community. I'm focused on product design development that impacts on people's lives with regards to keeping them independent, keeping them socially connected, and allowing them to remain independent for longer. I have several research interests, but specifically I focus on digital transformation. So with regards to my research, my PhD activities, which has led into my career, I've focused on information acquisition behaviors, specifically for the design development of smart digital appliances with emerging technologies, but focusing on devices with embedded technology, microprocessors. I look at information processing acquisition behavior, interaction, and interaction breakdowns. The reason I focus on this is that I have noticed over time that our interaction with product systems and services have changed. This change requires a need for focused design. Excuse me. With regards to my approach is centered on activity theory, responding to activities, operations, and also actions, where the focus is on human capability through observations of human difference, their use of technology, and assessment of activity. So what does this mean for research and my research area? Over my research practice, I have focused on specific areas of research EDI, which is equality, diversity, and inclusion in research outputs, in research teams, and research data collection. Over this time, I've identified 3 priority areas. and focus my research on these three areas. The first priority area is responding to discrimination and intersectionality of human activity. The next is focused on neglected communities, responding to the needs of pregnant women, Indigenous populations, first settlers. Then another priority area that I've really focused on is what I could call transdisciplinary design, where it's about co-design, co-production, and co-dissemination with researchers from other disciplines. So how does that work in practice? When we look at new paradigms of EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion in product, system, and service design. I base these on Professor Fralin, one of the great leaders at the Royal College of Art, that looked at into, for, and through in design, and focused that within the concept of EDI. So for, looking at EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion for rules and protocols for best practice. Looking at through, it's about responding to the lived experience of others. And the last is really focusing on best practice, the big R in research. Now, for me, the big R in research is research team. There is no point in being a great PI if you don't have a solid team behind you. And that's where capability-driven design comes into play. Now, I am a professor of public and industry understanding of capability-driven design, where we look at the me plus thinking, where it could be the individual data collected person, the researched, it could be the researcher or the research team. It's about looking at every aspect of the framework. So it's me, plus my activities, plus intervention, plus the tools that I'm using, plus the employment or the activities of research that I'm doing. And this framework gives us a better understanding of capabilities from the individual to end users, from manufacturing to production. With this in mind, my focus is preliminarily on emerging paradigms, working with interdisciplinary teams across the globe in order to produce solutions which best fit the needs of marginalized communities. With this in mind, my work focuses on transdisciplinary, working with different researchers across the globe, South Africa, in Kenya, focusing on coming up with interdisciplinary models, in this case, structural equation models, in order to identify links to dependent and independent variables which influence behavior and interaction. Current and expanding research focuses on several areas, but my main focus right now is decolonization of perspectives with regards to resilient health systems for health security. And at this point, I would like to just hand back to the moderator.
Thank you, Lisa Dion. Tell me, why did you choose to respond to the needs of vulnerable and marginalized communities?
Thank you. I appreciate the question. I think in my first instance, I was focusing really on discrimination and also intersectionality. When it comes to intersectionality, there are lived experiences from individuals which are not defined by their race or their color, its status, its wealth, its location, its people who you're participating with, its language. And I thought that that was missing from what can I only describe a Eurocentric view of what product systems and services look like. In order to design better services and systems, we need to encompass the needs and requirements of all, identifying their skills, their capabilities, their aspirations, and their needs.
You indicated that you are currently focusing on the health system needs. Can you tell us what a difference you think that will make in the population that you are servicing?
I think from the aspect of decolonization, it means that it's on several different levels. So when we're looking at decolonization, it's not just throwing out everything from the past, but it's acknowledging the cultural beliefs, the cultural knowledge, and also the ways in which we as people use services, systems, and products. From a perspective of why should we do it, it's about accepting and understanding the language, the semantics of product, services, and systems. It's about community participation and getting people involved in research that wouldn't normally be involved in research. And it's about autonomy of the individual, the research, and the researcher.
And we know that once persons feel involved, they own the work and respond that much better to it. We ask the audience if there are any questions to direct to Professor Morris, and thank Professor Morris for giving us just a brief insight into the her reach of her research.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Morris. Our next presenter is Dr. Yoselin Benitez Alfonso. Dr. Benitez Alfonso is an associate professor of plant sciences and UKRI Future Leaders Fellow at the University of Leeds. Originally from Cuba, she studied at the University of La Habana. She completed a PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology at the University of Cordoba, Spain, and followed up with postdoctoral placements at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in New York in the United States and at the John Innes Center in Norwich, UK. Yoselin's research focuses on the mechanisms regulating intercellular communication in plants using biological, physical, and mathematical approaches. She is committed to equality, diversity, and inclusion, and recently launched a network for Black researchers working in plant sciences in the UK. blackinplantscience.org. You can look up her website, and we would be interested in your feedback to Dr. Alfonso on her work. We now invite Dr. Yoselin Benitez Alfonso to present. Thank you, Professor Morris.
Thank you. Can you hear me? All right.
Yes,
yeah.
We are hearing you very well. Welcome.
Okay, so I'm gonna try to put my slides through. Just let me know if everything looks okay.
Yes, we are seeing your presentation nicely.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this celebration, and congratulations the University of West Indies for the 75th anniversary. As I was introduced, I am associate professor in plant science here at the University of Leeds in the UK, but I am originally from Cuba. So I work in an area of plant science that is very fundamentally looking at the pathways for communication between plant cells. But that has implications in terms of plant resilience to climate change, which of course you can imagine that have implications for food security and also for biomaterial development. So this picture that is here in this presentation was drawn by a researcher, but clearly and nicely kind of evidence, this kind of research that comes from our understanding of the issues that concern us on climate change, their impact in food security and crop agriculture, and immense efforts that are going on in the research community to understand what are the signaling pathways and also the solutions that we can implement for improving the tolerance to heat and drought stress. But I come from Cuba, so to tell you a little bit about my journey, how I got here. So I come from this small island, and I studied at the University of La Habana in Cuba for 2 years before I moved to the University of Cordoba in Spain, where I continued my undergrad in chemistry and did my PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology. From Spain, I moved then to the US, in Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories, where I started my work with plants and intercellular communication. And from the US, I moved back to Norwich, to the UK, to a Center of Excellence for Plant Science, the Young Innes Center, where I continue my work as a postdoctoral researcher before I got my lectureship in the University of Leeds in 2013. What I have learned from this journey is the importance and the critical play that has collaboration and interaction and communication throughout my whole research. So most of my work is actually in interdisciplinary collaborative teams that work together to find solutions for these really important sustainable goals that we are all facing. And without them, this research couldn't be possible in any way or means. So, but let me tell you a little bit about my research. So as you know, plants respond to the environment, no news there. So they respond to temperature, to nutrients, to water in the soil, to insects, and they have to do all of that without moving from the place where they are planted. They are just stuck with winter, with summer, with heat or cold. And they do that so effectively and survive those many conditions because they have ways to communicate their needs. Their needs from the root to the shoot, from the shoot to the root, from one plant to another plant. And they do that despite walls that we all have, just barriers, which plants are named cell walls. So they limit that communication, that transmission of signals. But plants are clever individuals. They actually have developed ways to overcome these barriers by creating channels, tunnels that communicate plant cells and allow them to transmit these signals between these organs and between cells. These channels are named plasmodesmata in plants, and they transport mobile factors such as RNA, proteins, water, and other molecules. Through plasmodesmata, there is a whole bunch of signals, but also pathogenic molecules. So viruses exploit plasmodesmata or these channels to transmit and spread throughout the plant, causing these massive viral infections. In these fruits, such as tomato, we can see the plasmodesmata channel just decorating the cell wall. And here you can see it in green in one of our immunolocalization confocal microscopy pictures, where we really look at how these channels are organized, what are the components that they have, and how they work. Because if we can control or understand how they work, perhaps we can understand better how plant cell communicates, and therefore kind of work with them to overcome the massive issues of climate change. So I am supported by a grant that is granted by the UK Research and Innovation Council, which is named PD Wall Mechanics. And I do that in interdisciplinary teams that concerns material scientists, structural biology, plant scientists working in genetics and mathematics, to look at how these channels are regulated, how the cell wall composition change when these plants are overcoming some of the stresses, and how we can develop biotechnological tools to engineer plants to respond better, and how we can exploit that knowledge that we have now on cell walls, on these components, to develop new biomaterials, cellulosic derived biomaterials. So this work is not done by myself. It's also a group of international and multinational group of researchers. That is my team, which span from UK, India, Serbia, Lithuania, from Nigeria. And all of them are working together in dedicating their study in cell walls, in plant communication, but also exploring translation opportunities to bring that research into practical applications. What we are working right now. So we are looking at how these channels communicate, how the cell wall and proteins that target these channels behave and are regulated by environmental conditions, and how the regulation of these proteins really impact the plant development. And we are doing this as well by looking at how cell wall components assemble, how they disassemble, and how are they modified by these signalings, and how the mechanical properties of the cell wall change when these components are modified. And then looking at how these processes interact as well with important symbiotic systems, such as nitrogen-fixing bacteria interaction with legumes, which actually are the source of biological nitrogen in our soils, such as that's an important sustainable solution for climate change and limiting the degradation of the soils. So this is some of our research. We are also working in understanding the mechanical properties of cell walls. So we work in the Bragg Center with the material research in using IFM nanoindentation and looking at those cell walls channels and the cell walls around them, how they are modulated and what are the elasticity or mechanical properties of it, and then create biomaterials from this knowledge by using hydrogels, and then looking at the structures of these hydrogels and looking at then how we can mimic what the plant cell wall is into this biomaterial, which offer new opportunities for drug release, but also for film or paper development. So these are some of our areas of research. And as I say, it's not only me. This is only possible because of communication, because of collaboration. So plasmodesmata are not only the conduit for the movement of signals, for the movement of proteins, it's also the conduit for this amazing team to collaborate and integrate their knowledge together and looking all for solutions to our major sustainable development goals. And we are supported by all these institutions. And I cannot leave from here without plugging my Black Implant Science Network, which I hope that this is also a career for other Black plant scientists, researchers to connect, celebrate, and cultivate the next generation. So bringing them together and finding them a community in which they can flourish and they can, enhance and become the new generation of academics. And that's all from me. Thank you. And I open any questions.
Thank you, Professor Benitez Alfonso. As a food chemist, my question to you is going to relate in part to that of food. Can you indicate which part of your research can be translated into applications that impact food security, climate change, or any other sustainable development goal?
Very good questions. Thank you very much for asking. As I say, we work very collaboratively with a number of scientists. I can offer you two examples. So we work with ICRISAT in India, in which we are involved in developing new chickpeas by breeding technology through understanding basically which markers in chickpeas are conferring then their drought and heat tolerance. So there are some varieties of chickpeas that are drought and heat tolerance and others that are not. So by looking at what are the genes that are involved in that drought tolerance, and by selecting them in breeding approaches, they have been able to develop new chickpea varieties or basically commercialize new chickpea varieties that have that characteristic. On the other side, I collaborate also with Futamura, which is an industry developing cellulose biomaterials. And one of our areas is understanding how lignocellulosic waste, so how waste that is coming from the agriculture or from crop agriculture, is composed. So what is the composition and what is the capability of extracting cellulose from that waste and use it in making only supplemented the good cellulose that is the one that is continuously used in films and evidently not sustainable because we actually get rid of our trees and our forest. So this is our two aspects of the research in which I can exemplify applications.
Thank you. We remind our audience that we will accept questions for Dr. Benitez Alfonso, and also as we progress, please remember you can post questions in the chat for Professor Morris and our other presenters. We thank Dr. Benitez Alfonso for sharing some of her interesting research with us. And we look forward to continuing to hear more about the work that she does. Thank you, Dr. Benitez Alfonso. Up next, we have Dr. Winnie Bedigan. Dr. Bedigan is a lecturer in international development at the University of Leeds. Winnie's research interests focus on indigenous knowledge in peace building, gender, in particular women, and development in South Sudan and the Horn of Africa. This afternoon, we invite Dr. Bedigan to share with us some of the work that she has been doing in this area.
Thank you very much, Lisa and everybody else for organizing this. So just to go back a little bit on this, I'm Winnie Bedigan. My background, my PhD is in peace building, but then of course now I focus more on empowerment, women empowerment. Now, how I got here was that, so back in 2000, when I came over to the UK, I wanted to go to school to study. So I ended up doing BSc Computer Science, but then towards the end of it, I was quite bored. So I wanted to do an MA, a master's degree, but then of course, computer sciences was quite boring to me. So I decided to go for a postgrad fair, and I saw this beautiful course, which was titled Conflict Resolution. Then I remembered that, I've gone through conflicts. As a child, I experienced civil wars, hiding in the bush with the family, with mom, with dad, but I didn't understand why people were fighting. I didn't understand why we went through that. So I did that course, an MA, and I found it actually very interesting. So much as I grew up in Africa, I didn't really understand that, there were different dynamics to conflicts, why people were fighting. We had our own interpretation, and we never even learned it. We never learned the causes of wars at school. And even if we asked adults about them, they never really told us much about why there was fighting going on, one civil war after another, ethnic conflicts, etc. So I ended up actually doing PhD in the same area, conflict resolution. But I think what struck me most was that, the mass media reporting at that point was presenting, Africa and the militia people as though like barbaric people who always like fighting, people who, they are out of control. And this really got into me. And I was asking myself, I grew up in Africa, but we were not really encouraged to fight. There were really, morals that guided us from fighting. Why is it that it's reported this way? So then I went for PhD, but my PhD, of course, now focused on the traditional methods of conflict resolution, because, wars have been in Africa for a very long time, and it's mostly the United Nations that has been responsible for conflict resolution, and of course the other, child to the United Nations in the African Union. And of course, because African Union actually follows up on the protocols of the United Nations, then African Union follows up, the instructions and the structure of the United Nations. So my research then actually opened my eyes a lot, because, much as it was reported that the African people are more of like people who like fighting, I realized that maybe that's not the case, because there are traditions that are in place that actually could help. As a matter of fact, as you watch, the news that talk about the civil wars in Africa, the ethnic groups, in fact, you'll find that there are communities out there that are very much responsible for preventing these conflicts. They have those customs, those norms that help them prevent these conflicts. Times it go out of hand, and actually one of the reasons why it goes out of hand is because some of these militias then have access to weapons, and who sells the weapons to them? The weapons, of course, most of them actually come from the West. Okay, so it's so complex. So from the peace building, then I realized that actually at the heart of it all was women. Women, whether the guns are going on, whether they have the silence of guns, the women are always there. Women are resilient. Then I realized that actually, what makes these women resilient like this? So I remember during my PhD, I saw this presentation by Accord. Accord is one of the companies that used to be so much publishing and researching issues to do with conflict resolution in Africa. And they had put in these women who are like well-established, I would say degree holders, educated women, as at the forefront of peace building in Africa. That really made me question. I said, okay, I myself experienced conflict, but then I realized that there were local women who were there, and these are the local women who went on, some of them actually braved their lives to go and talk to the militia groups so that they stopped fighting. But now, when you look at what the world is putting forward, it's mostly like women who can speak English, or those who have been to school, or those who are having some kind of job, some kind of capacity. And then it kept me asking, what is it that we have to bring out of this? Because why is it that there's that woman that is always there, come war, come no war, but they are there in the community and they are helping in terms of peace building. So that actually now brought me into thinking about, issues to do with women empowerment, because again, when you look at what's happening or what has been happening over the years, when they talk about women, they tend to think like, okay, the women who have not been to school, the women who don't have jobs, the women who are, live in rural areas, these women are not empowered. But that's quite not true. Okay, so my work actually focuses on highlighting some of the norms, the cultural norms, the cultural the values that helps us understand that actually, instead of us thinking, or instead of the world thinking like, okay, there are women who are not empowered and we should go and empower them. Actually, these women are empowered and we should learn from them and find out, what are those values? What are those customs? What is that knowledge that they have that we could work with to help us understand more about how to help them enhance this. Okay. So Then why Indigenous women empowerment is mainly focusing on 4 key areas here. Like I've already introduced the idea, you will find that I am so much interested in gender in African studies, and this is because of the gender mainstreaming debates. You'll find that gender mainstreaming has mainly been dealing with women of a certain class, and it's not talking about the indigenous women. And that's what I'm interested in because of some of the characteristics that they demonstrate, through many challenges that come in. So we've mentioned issues to do with climate change, issues to do with conflict, issues to do with poverty, but these women are resilient. So I'm interested in gender in African studies in that context. Okay. Then of course there's that issue of sustainability. How do we understand sustainability when it comes to women empowerment? Because when you look at what has been happening, it's like, especially when you look at SDG 5, what they are trying to do is to make sure that the interventions actually focus on empowering women, but these interventions are from external sources. They are not really looking at what is actually present, what women have, and which I think actually is not quite right and cannot be sustainable, especially when we are talking about making sure that what we put in the lives of these women or in communities remains there forever. Okay. Then my work, especially on the indigenous women empowerment, help us actually address the knowledge gap, the deficiencies that exist out there, because not a lot is known about, the local women, the women who live in rural areas in the sub-Saharan Africa or generally in Africa. So my work then tries to illuminate some of these ideas. Okay. And then of course, I look at my research as, ceremony research, where I look at a holistic approach of it. So I want to understand issues that impact women, but of course I understand it not through the questionnaire, developing questionnaires, but I go through the traditional, subtle methods which involve like storytelling, because I want to hear women's stories, what stories do they have to tell? What relations do they have? What kind of participation, what kind of practices is there? What kind of foods do they use when they are, helping in terms of restoring these relationships, the cultural protocols, the values, the behaviors, etc. So these are the issues that I am interested in, and the issues that make me, understand that women empowerment is just beyond an intervention from somebody who is coming from somewhere else or an external entity. Okay. So then how we understand women empowerment is so much based on the cultural norms that these women actually demonstrate when it comes to the issues that they face. Okay, you realize that in research there has been a lot of what they call the othering in social sciences, where there is always this issue of identifying the problems the other women are facing. Like, for example, the women is in the sub-Saharan Africa, people identify the Western people in the West identify the problems they are facing, like, for example, poverty, maybe unemployment, or maybe marginalization, and then they run to go and try to solve that problem, not knowing that there is more to that, So some of these policies then that are used, and these policies, of course, are mainly drawn from the international communities, like, for example, the United Nations, then you find the IMF, the World Bank, etc. They are actually non-contextual, and because they are non-contextual, it then makes it difficult for what? For the sort of intervention to actually help to be sustainable in that community. So, as I've already said, most of these interventions have been aligned with SDG 5, and some of them include, like, for example, skilling women. A lot of women in the sub-Saharan region, a lot of NGOs have gone there and they have tried to skill women, like, for example, they have gone on to help them learn, for example, tailoring. Some of them maybe they've learned income generating. They've given the money for income generating projects. There are some who have NGOs who have come up with social activities, like, for example, the teenage karate classes. But then in reality, when you look at it, some of these interventions are quite non-contextual. Okay, much as skilling is good, that, women who have done tailoring can end up, earning some income. But when you actually go and investigate, you'll find that women in the village, maybe about 20 of them have gone to do tailoring. At the end of the day, they give them, after their training, they give them machines to go and start their businesses. And because there is a lot of them who have done the same kind of training, then there is no market for them. So it takes them to, square zero. Okay. So, but this is because most times, the norms, the cultures, the understanding of who these women are or what they need is actually not taken into place. It's just because the policies are decided by somebody else, this top-down approach, which is not really helping. Okay, so you'll find some interventions, like for example, the karate classes. There was this NGO that had developed karate classes, and it was meant to prevent some kind of what do they call teenage pregnancies. But then that was in the context of some countries, like for example, South Sudan, where you find it's mostly a Muslim community. So karate classes would require a young girl to dress up maybe in some sort of trousers or something. So if you introduce that kind of activity there, who is it? Which community? Which kind of girls are you going to capture in that community? Because you are not being consensual. So context actually matters when it comes to what? Women empowerment. But because women empowerment issues has been so much handled by the Western-centric ideas or Western-centric agencies, then you find that they miss it out. They tend to transfer what is existing in the West and want to plant it and introduce it in the sub-Saharan region or to African people, and yet actually it's out of context and then it is not really sustainable. Okay, so another thing about the sustainability is that, some of the ideas that I introduced, women are quite not familiar to them. Just highlighted the issues of the karate, etc. And then, of course, the maintenance as well. Sometimes, because I do development work as well with some NGOs, you go to Africa and you find there's this big building that has been there. It's been rented for women, something, maybe women were doing some sort of learning or practice. But, once the project is done, the building is abandoned, it's not maintained. And then you realize that actually, this is not really sustainable. We have to try to understand women empowerment from a different perspective. Okay. Then at times you'll find the administrative structures for some of these interventions is not there. And then, of course, you would think if somebody is bringing in an intervention, they would actually try to look at it in a holistic way. Like, for example, if you look at income generating projects, what about a situation where women in rural areas, they don't have water? So even if you give them money to be able to have an income generating project, if they don't have access to water, how are they going to be able to empower themselves? How are they going to be able to sustain that? So in other words, some of these approaches that have been used to empower women, mainly in the sub-Saharan region, they are not really contextual, and they are not sustainable. Okay. So in my understanding, it kind of looks like something like this, the conventional women empowerment looks like something like this. There is a woman there, but then there is also the consideration of communities. And by that, they mainly look at the leaders. They look at the civil society. And of course, it's the NGOs that are dealing with these women. Like, for example, they should start karate classes. And then, of course, you'll find the state is there, or state policies. And because most of these interventions, as I mentioned earlier on, influenced by international agencies, of course, they go through the governments. And the governments also, in the South, in Global South, do not question some of these policies. So the main actors would be then the state, and then the community. But the community, mainly the NGOs who are promoting this sort of activities. And then, of course, women. And that is not quite detailed enough. So my work actually looks at that holistic approach that looks at what goes on beyond those three aspects, So for me, in order to understand, women empowerment and help, in order to bring in sustainability in this area, we have to engage in a holistic way. So the state has to be there, all right, but then there should be also community leaders, NGO, etc. The key thing here then, therefore, is the family, the cultures, the knowledge, the structures, the practices. Unless you understand the context of those practices, of those cultures, the knowledge, indigenous knowledge, then it becomes difficult for you to make that project sustainable. And then, of course, another aspect of this is the age itself, because, they tend to generalize, like, let's say, if the NGOs are dealing with women who are experiencing poverty, they tend to, put in every woman there. They don't actually distinguish them according to age, and age group actually matters a lot when it comes to empowering women, because you can't mix up the old women, put them in one group because of the cultural kind of barriers, the issues to do with respect, etc. So when you look at what is happening and what I want to bring to the world is that it's very important that the understanding of women empowerment is looked at from the cultural perspective, the indigenous understanding, where you don't only look at what the state is providing or the policies, or you're not only looking at what the NGOs are doing with the women, but you need to look deep into the cultures, the customs, the values, the practices, the age groups of these women. So with that, I hand over back to the moderator.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Bedigian.
Mm.
Tell me, what drives your interest in researching Indigenous women empowerment in Sub-Saharan Africa?
Thank you very much for that question. So, as I told you before, I grew up in Africa, and what I think is that women have always fought their corners. Women have always fought, especially if you look at the context, the cultures in which I work, you will find that it's always like a culture that would prefer to have male, children. Of course, these days things have changed a little bit, but you'll find that there are those cultures that would actually neglect girls, and prefer boys. And it's up to these girls actually to try to fight their corners. Okay. So the most interesting thing is that some of these women, for example, when it comes to adulthood, they use their subtle ways. Like, for example, they use their feminine characteristics, they use their womanhood, they use their jewelry, they use their bells in advocating, in managing, in challenging situations. Now, we've heard of wars that are happening, for example, in South Sudan, but rarely do you hear about the contribution of indigenous women. So indigenous women in some of these war-torn areas have used their subtle norm. Like, for example, in South Sudan, women have used nudity as a way to tell men that, stop fighting. So they've made nude protests. In some places in Uganda, women have actually saved their land from land grab. There's a lot of land grab issues that's going on in Africa. Women have managed, local women have managed, indigenous women have managed to save their land by nude protests. And then some other women in, for example, Kenya, they have managed to use there's a special belt that they use that's called loketio, is used to stop men from going to fight, because what they do once they have heard that men are going to fight, they'll put that belt along the way, and when men see that, they will not cross that belt. They'll just have to go back. It's some of these ideas that I want to bring to others to know that actually it's important that we look into some of these practices that have always been used, and they have actually helped to maintain communities for a very long time. Okay, so you would want to think like that subtle ways, cultural norms, they should be the starting point of understanding women empowerment, not the other way around. Because often it's been like, okay, these women need to be developed. We need to send girls to school. We need to bring in money, generating income. But nobody goes deep down to ask really these women what kind of knowledge they have, what kind of customs they value, how they want to manage their lives. That one is never brought into context. So it makes me really quite interested in researching. And I would think like, this kind of what women have, the knowledge they have, the values they have, these are the values that need to be enhanced. So and that's what will make empowerment sustainable. But if you intervene from, bringing ideas from outside and the ideas which are not familiar, then those ideas will not be sustainable. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question from a member of the audience.
Yeah.
Even though in many countries women are increasing their presence in academics, there are only a few at the top levels of research and leadership. For example, globally, only 12% of universities are led by women, and in the UK, while 45% staff are women, only 26% have senior leadership positions. In the global south, the situation is even worse. The problem all around is the work-life balance, obligations to family and children, etc. So what practical methods are being proposed to address this?
Thank you very much for that question. Yeah, thank you very much. Now, what I see here is, a life of a woman, as I mentioned earlier on, is about really fighting your ground. I don't think there is that general practical, advice that can be given in that situation. But I have seen women who have had their own sort of agency. They have advocated for themselves. Actually, it's more of an individualistic thing more than like something that the government brings in or an organization brings in. So there is no general, I think, approach to that. I think it's at the moment it's more of an individual fight, really.
The person who posed that question went on to say that mechanisms, for instance, which empower women to travel with their children for training or for work, or that helps women in the global south to build local infrastructure for research so they don't always have to leave their families behind. Do we see any of that taking place or being considered?
Thank you very much. I think that depends on where that woman is. So if that woman is living in an urban setting, there will be always, daycare, schools. But again, it depends whether the agency can pay for it because some of these services are quite expensive. Now, mostly women in rural areas, of course, will depend on the older children actually to help them when it comes to childcare. And services like this are not easily accessible in the rural area. So it depends on where that woman is. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Dr. Bedigan, we thank you for your presentation. Up next, we have Dr. Sally Osei-Appiah. Dr. Osei-Appiah is the postgraduate research diversity lead, student success at educational engagement at the University of Leeds. This new role she took up in April 2022 enables her to lead a number of on-program support projects for underrepresented PhD students within Leeds, as well as externally. Prior to assuming her current role, Sally was a research fellow at the School of Law, and before that, a teaching fellow at the School of Media and Communication at the University of Leeds. As an academic, Sally's research focus was on gender, media, and politics, with special focus on gendered political communication, digital campaigning, African political journalism, and visual communication. Besides publishing for both academic and non-academic audiences, Sally has also been involved in several public engagement events where she's shared her expertise on women in politics, gender inequality, democracy, and sustainable development goals in Africa. She is reviews editor for the journal Information, Communication, and Society. Ladies and gentlemen, we invite Dr. Sally Osei-Appiah to share with us some highlights of her research.
Thank you very much. I'll go ahead to share my screen. Can you see that?
I am seeing your screen, and we ask that you go into. Thank you. That's wonderful.
Yeah, okay.
Perfect.
All right. Okay. So, as has been mentioned, my name is Sally Osei-Appiah. A bit about myself. I am originally from Ghana, and I have been in the UK since 2014. When I did my master's and then went on to do a PhD in media and communication, focusing on gender and political communication. So my area of expertise cover gender and media, gendered political communication, African political journalism, and quite recently EDI in higher education, based on my current role as the postgraduate research diversity lead at the University of Leeds. So for today's presentation, I have titled it, Why It Sucks to Be a Female Politician? And I want this to be a provocation of some sort for all of us. And hopefully by the time I finish the presentation, you understand why. I'll be drawing on my research in Ghana and Nigeria, as well as the UK. So let's start with how female politicians are usually represented in the media with these two images. And before that, when I say the word media, I'm referring to the collective term for traditional media comprising radio, newspaper, and television. And now to the images. On the left is a March 2017 article in the UK newspaper, the Daily Mail, showing two female politicians in the image. You would see on the left, Nicola Sturgeon, who was the Scottish Prime Minister, who recently stepped down from her post. And then on the right is Theresa May, who was the UK Prime Minister at the time. So both of them are now ex-Prime Ministers. The picture captures a meeting they had to discuss the UK's exit from the UK and its implications for Scotland. And of all the things that were discussed in that meeting, this is what the journalists chose to highlight on their front page in the newspaper. Now, the second image is an article in the newspaper, The Chronicle, which is a Ghanaian newspaper, showing Otiko Jaba, who was the gender minister in Ghana at the time. She had gone to Parliament to give a speech about the value of celebrating International Men's Day. And as it turned out, her dress choice was what made the front page news the next day. So half of the article, the first half of the article, focused on how Otiko had caused such a stir in Parliament with an indecent exposure of her boobs, which has so unsettled the MPs, particularly the men in the room, because she had been projected on a giant screen, making her boobs even more visible. So after much discomfort, two male MPs who could stand the scene no longer signaled to a female MP who, after much confusion, got up, walked over to the front where Otiko was in the middle of her speech, and rearranged the muffler around her neck. So you can see the muffler here that was rearranged to cover her boobs. As you can imagine, the description in the article was obviously more graphic than I have described here, but at least it gives a sense of what occurred in Parliament. And it makes you wonder why a journalist thought this was more important than what Otiko, the gender minister at the time, has said in Parliament that day. And unfortunately, such news items are not uncommon. And interestingly, both articles were written by women, and both articles focus on the appearance or dress of the female politician rather than what they said. So the key argument is that for a female politician, her sex is always on display, always the primary descriptor. She's defined by what she's not, that is, that she's not a typical politician. And why does this matter? Why should we be concerned about such articles in the news? Because research tells us that media coverage of politicians is not neutral, as we expect, but very gendered and discriminatory, disadvantaging female politicians. And let's look at some evidence. Coverage of female politicians, according to Ross, is refracted through the lens of trivialization, marginalization, and commodification, where their gender roles and physical appearance appear more newsworthy than what they say. So female politicians tend to be less visible in the news, whether it's textually or visually. They are given less speaking time. They are quoted less and reported more, which means journalists have more opportunity to reframe what they said, whether accurately or inaccurately. Female politicians also tend to have their representation focused more on the personal. So we learn about their clothes choices, their hair, their shoes, whether they are married or not, whether they have children or not, etc. And then they are often portrayed as less competent, weak, emotional, childish, and thus politically unsuitable. The situation for male politicians, however, is very different. So coverage of male politicians is normally issue-based, allowing them to demonstrate their political competence through their views on policies and current affairs. So even on the rare occasion when the media choose to focus on the personal, it still serves male politicians well because it makes them more human, more relatable, more personable. So this example here from the BBC about the former Liberian President Johnson Sirleaf and her political opponent George Weah is a good example. We see how Sirleaf's electoral victory is diminished through describing her as a 67-year-old grandmother, while we see George Weah being elevated as a football star. The fact that Sirleaf was a former finance minister or an astute economist who has worked in several notable banks, including the World Bank, is not mentioned in the article. So these seemingly harmless descriptions and omissions consistently made over time contribute to diminishing female politicians' political competence, which in turn affects their electoral success. So why is reporting on politicians so gendered, and why should we care? We need to care because news reporting is not as factual as we assume it to be. News is very much shaped by ideology. And in this case, we are looking at how gender ideology shapes the news by perpetuating gender roles based on socially shared expectations for men's and women's behavior in society, whereby men are assigned to decision-making arena, while women are assigned to the domestic roles. So this means men in political roles are viewed as operating in their natural element, while women in politics are seen as rule breakers because they are going against the norm. The problem is the news media are the primary source of symbolic material out of which people construct their understanding and evaluation of political actors, of conditions and events. And so this means that as voters, what we see and what we hear in the news about politicians informs how we think about them, how we evaluate them, and how we vote. Again, we know that media visibility confers legitimacy and importance to politicians. So when female politicians are hardly seen or heard of in the news, for instance, or that they're given less time to speak, or that we see them more often in relation to their personal lives rather than their professional or political achievements, we begin to think they don't belong in politics. So these sexist representations of female politicians in the news form a major barrier to increasing women's political participation because they reinforce and perpetuate the masculinization of politics. So what can we do? As voters, we need to face our own gender biases and how we evaluate female politicians. And for those of us who have the opportunity to train or work with journalists, we need to hold them to account. We need to call out sexist reporting whenever we encounter it. And I want to end with these two quotes from my research in Ghana and Nigeria. So the first one here is from a female presidential candidate in Nigeria who said, "I remember I was being interviewed on a radio program and one man called in and was like, just tell this woman to go back to her home and to her kitchen." And this was a presidential candidate. The other quote is from an MP in Ghana who said, "Female politicians get a really raw deal, you know, and nobody ever talks about a man being divorced, about a man having multiple families, about a man having children he's not looking after. Nobody ever talks about that in the media. When they want to attack a man for things that he's done, it's never to do with his sexuality or his history or whatever it is in terms of his personal life. But when a woman takes up a political position or is in the spotlight, she's a prostitute, or she slept her way into her position, or she can't keep a man, or she's divorced." We need to remember that female politicians face several layers of bias, which significantly impact their political success. So let us not add to it by allowing sexist reports, such as those presented here, to inform our voting choices. Thank you very much.
We thank you, Dr. Say Appiah. What key message would you like the audience to take away from your presentation today?
That's a good question. So it's about creating awareness of the barriers that female politicians face just because of their gender, just because they are women. And the fact that although we rely a lot on the news media to inform us of what's happening in the political scene and to inform us of what our politicians are doing, what decisions they're making, what policies they're sharing, etc., we need to understand and remember always that all news is framed in particular ways to suit the organization. And in this case, we need to understand that news about politicians, it's very gendered and discriminatory. So having said that, this is why I said this was a provocation for all of us as voters, as people who evaluate politicians and particularly female politicians. We need to be able to think in ways that are objective and not sort of dismiss female politicians just because they are women. But if we have to dismiss any politician who is a woman, it has to be because they are not politically competent. And it's for us to also know that we should not base the full of our decisions or evaluation on female politicians or what we see in the news, but we should begin to think of other ways of getting to know our politicians, particularly our female politicians, and how that is going to inform the way we vote. Because if we continue to rely solely on what the news tells us, then we are going to continue making the mistake of evaluating female politicians along these very gendered lines, and that is going to inform us likely not voting for them. So that's the key message that I want us to take away, that we all, face our gender biases and make better objective choices when it comes to evaluating female politicians.
We thank you for your presentation, and we thank you for putting it into context and helping to raise awareness of these gender biases. Thank you, Dr. Say Appiah. Up next, we have Professor Mona Webber. Professor Webber is a marine biologist in the Department of Life Sciences at the University of the West Indies Mona campus. with over 30 years of experience in research and teaching in Jamaica's coastal waters. In addition to being director of the Center for Marine Sciences and the Discover Bay Marine Laboratory, she is presently the James S. Moss Solomon Senior Chair in Environmental Management at the UWI. Professor Weber currently supervises several graduate students in research projects ranging from mangrove and seagrass assessment for development of appropriate conservation and rehabilitation approaches. She looks at mangrove and seagrass carbon sequestration, the blue carbon value, and the biodiversity associated with these highly valuable ecosystems. Her other research interests include assessments of coastal water quality using plankton, assessment of plastics and microplastics in coastal areas, and investigating the sargassum seaweed inundation and the potential for use of the algal biomass. Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome Professor Mona Weber as she presents this afternoon.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And as I share my screen, I hope you're able to see, yes. Quite a mouthful of areas of interest. And I really need to thank my team. I'm a marine biologist who really is a zooplankton ecologist. That is my main area of research. That's where I did my PhD. But I have been pulled into a plethora of areas by persons who are passionate about those particular areas, by persons who have seen the issues and want to explore those areas. And so I've become lots of things because not only do I want to foster and really develop interest in our young Caribbean and Jamaican scientists, I think we need all hands on deck. We need these young minds to really help us solve the issues. And so I want to speak on 3 issues. The list of things I've been involved in is bewildering to me, but there are 3 issues that I think are related, and issues that have been described, some of them as the greatest single threat to the Caribbean in the last decade. So I spoke on microplastics or plastics and mangroves and sargassum on a larger scale, and I thought to pull these out from my research because we've done some publications on them, but more importantly, the findings of our research have helped in decision making. So we have been working in Kingston Harbor and its waters, in the coastal waters of Jamaica, for a long time. And over the last 2 decades, the issues of plastics in our waters have really been coming to the fore. And in perhaps, I think it's since 2015, we began to look at the issue of what happens to plastics as they remain in our environment. They don't remain as large, intact particles, bottles or bags. They weather, they fragment, and they become microplastics, which are by and large invisible, but tremendously more effective at damaging our systems and our species or food that we collect from the marine environment. In 2015, we estimated 3% of the plastics in the ocean to be microplastics. By 2018, that percentage had risen to 50%. And we're sure by now that the quantities of microplastics have gone well beyond the quantities of macroplastic that we easily see. And so there was quite a flutter of interest, research into quantifying and indicating the types of plastics. But we thought also it would be very important to indicate the types of microplastics, because this material gets into our food, into our oysters, into our fish, and very important to understand and have baselines for these materials. And so we through partnerships with the 5 Gyres international team, we were able to get a Mantotrol, the appropriate sampling equipment. We partnered with chemistry to help us with the assessment of the polymers in the plastics. And so for the first time, we were able to identify the dominant types of plastic that were persisting in our waters. And these are the ones that you can't see, and so may easily overlook their importance in the system. What this does, it helps to inform decision-making. We were able to affect how we approach the plastic pollution on land and in our general environment, not just the marine environment. We realized that we needed to turn off the plastic tap. And so we could recommend how and when certain grades, certain types of plastics should be given attention. And this is a very important bridge from science to action. We know that we have to turn off the plastic tap. And this will be incremental, this will be gradual. And so plastic bans and their timelines have to be informed by the science that we do. But very importantly, we have been able to galvanize NGOs and CBOs and engineers and corporate entities into helping us to reduce the quantities of plastics. When you explain that there's a barrier like this at one of the gullies at Kingston Harbor, all this plastic that you can see, there is twice as much that you can't see in our sediments, in the water column, in the species. And so it helps to galvanize action because it has bearing on so much, even on food security. And so we are very interested in attacking the problems that are at the fore in Jamaica and the Caribbean. And the sargassum seaweed problem is the other one I want to highlight. Again, this is a relatively recent issue in the Caribbean, and it's been treated as an international crisis. We began getting sargassum in 2011, and it has only increased since. We now are amassing up to 24 million metric tons of sargassum in our waters. Now, sargassum is algae, marine algae, very, very beneficial marine algae in its natural state and in its natural quantities. The Sargasso Sea is a tremendous environment. We know that many important finfish have their life cycles in the Sargasso Sea. There's tremendous endemism in the Sargasso Sea. So we don't want to vilify the Sargasso Sea, but this relatively new problem in the Caribbean could not be ignored. It is triggered by climate change, but it's sustained by the nutrients we are putting into our systems and how we misuse our natural resources. And so we have turned our research towards focusing on sargassum. Can we turn off the sargassum tap like we are seeking to turn off the plastic tap? That is not so easy. But we believe the Caribbean, and we call ourselves small island developing states, but we're really large ocean economies, as one prime minister has put it. But we have to learn to use the resources that are around us and also those that have turned up literally on our doorstep. And so a lot of our research, my research, has focused on how to use sargassum. It's algal biomass, and it is coming in such huge quantities that it can have tremendous applications. And so in exploring these applications, we've partnered with colleagues at the University of York, and in fact, teams from our marine labs across Jamaica. And we have sought to look at especially what is in the sargassum, what is its biochemical composition and other materials in the sargassum, so that we can use the science to advise how the material can and should be used or not used, as is the case. And so it's good feedstock. It's a tremendous brown alga that can be used in numerous applications, but we have to understand how to handle it. We have to understand how it changes when it's processed or stored. And we have to understand how, for example, local persons can use the material based on our understanding of its chemistry and of its biochemistry, of its elements. And so fairly simple findings about how local handling and storing of sargassum will change the value-added compounds. Other issues related to, for example, how we use sargassum on our soils, how we handle material so that we maximize its benefits. And sargassum valorization and use has been purported to be the solution for a number of issues that we at the university have been grappling with for a while. We've been talking about plastics and alternatives to plastics, and sargassum can be used to make bioplastics. And so that could mitigate the issue of microplastics that we're having and potentially having in our waters. We are always looking for soil amelioration and stimulants, soil restoring additives, so we can maximize our plant growth without using excess fertilizer. And so we don't add excess nutrients to our oceans, to our waterways. Sargassum may hold the answer for the extracts, may have some of those biostimulants that we can use. And a very important area for us is related to our climate, is the ability of the plant to sequester carbon and the business of carbon credits. In fact, there are a plethora of scientists within and outside the Caribbean who are looking at how sargassum should be valued and how it can be used. And composting was identified by SOS Carbon, our colleagues, as one of the ways. And it suddenly struck me. We struggle in doing coastal restoration activities. We struggle with our mangroves, especially in certain areas where the coastline has been changed, where we have had reclamation of the mangrove forest and replacing that with boulders and sand and poor quality soil for mangroves. And so, excuse me, we decided to explore whether sargassum could also be used in one of the areas that we've been doing a tremendous amount of research in mangrove restoration. And so we collected sargassum, we composted sargassum, and we applied sargassum in our plant nursery at the Discovery Bay Marine Lab to see how the material would be used by the plant and would that enhance, for example, the survival of the seedlings in the outplanted system. And where our findings indicate the best ratio of sargassum compost to use in our nurseries. But interestingly, our findings also help to highlight the issues that we have been facing with mangrove loss and the need to effectively restore mangroves. And the association with mangroves and climate and coastal protection, those are inextricable. And so the attention of, or the linking of giving sargassum attention to see how it can help in mangrove restoration was a critical pivoting in our research. But soberingly, we found, and it's been reported now extensively, that sargassum has high quantities of inorganic arsenic. And so we now know while we will successfully grow mangroves and seedlings in the sargassum compost, we can't transfer the compost to the environment. The mangrove plants don't take up the arsenic, very little in the plant at the end of our experiments, but the compost in which they're planted has high quantities of arsenic. And so these issues around our environment, we have to use our science to inform and to help with decision making and to help communities decide how to use and how their lives can be affected by the proper application of these resources. We like to consider them, because the Caribbean and Jamaica, our marine environment is our life. And we welcome partners and research that will help us preserve and maintain the integrity of this environment for a long time. I must recognize a plethora of partners, a plethora of funders, and universities. We had an excellent conference most of this morning with colleagues from the University of Ghana, from Southampton, from University of York, and from across the Caribbean, looking at what we have learned so far as we seek to address the issues and the opportunities that are being presented in our marine environment today. Thank you so much for listening, and I welcome questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Weber. Indeed, partnerships do make the research speak much more loudly. I have a question for you. As a small island developing state nestled in the Caribbean, Jamaica has already begun to be affected by global climate change. How has your research been influenced by the need to respond to these effects of climate change?
Thank you for that question. There could be several aspects of research that could relate to that, but I think mangroves and the business of restoring, conserving, and restoring mangroves is tremendous in mitigating the effects of climate change. And mangroves, we now know, can pull 10 times the carbon and much faster than terrestrial systems. We have begun to look at also how the mangroves are being lost, what's causing the destruction of our forest, because we recognize that coastal fortification, the combination of engineering solutions and green solutions like mangroves. Mangroves are extremely effective at preventing coastal erosion. And so the promotion of mangroves from being swamps and smelly areas that really can be removed for better and more attractive infrastructure. We have to raise the awareness that mangroves are tremendously valuable and are actually critical to the fight against the effects of climate change.
I thank you for that response. Indeed, we have seen some catastrophic events across the world where the removal of mangroves have resulted in a number of natural disasters and loss of life. So we do appreciate your research in this area and look forward to hearing more of it. Thank you, Professor Weber. As we move to our next presenter, Professor Tanisha Stevenson. Professor Stevenson is co-director of the Climate Studies Group at the Mona campus and Deputy Dean in the Faculty of Science and Technology at the University of the West Indies here in Jamaica. Her research interests are Caribbean climate variability and change, climate extremes, and statistical modeling. She has published over 75 journal articles, book chapters, monographs, and technical reports with her collaborators. Her work experience includes conducting research as a visiting fellow at the Climatic Research Unit at the University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom. Professor Stevenson has served on a number of international teams, including the Coordinated Regional Climate Downscaling Experiment Science Advisory Team, shortened as CORDEX-SAT, and the task team on Guide to Climatological Practices of the World Meteorological Organization. She was also a lead author on Chapter 10, Linking Global to Regional Climate Change, for the Working Group 1 contribution to the IPCC 6th Assessment Report. Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome Professor Stevenson as she presents on her research. Professor Stevenson, we are so excited to hear you this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Dr. Donna Manis-Cates. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. This afternoon, I will speak on Caribbean climate change research that's happening on the Mona campus. And I'm presenting work that has been conducted by a number of members of the Climate Studies Group, Mona, as you heard in the introduction. So we're speaking to Caribbean climate variability and change, the Mona experience. And so our context has already been laid for us. Our livelihoods are severely impacted by variability and change in our region. And something that has been identified for us as small island states is that climate change represents one of the gravest challenges to survival and viability of our states. Why is this? We're extremely sensitive. We have these familiar climate patterns. We live on narrow coastal zones. We conduct business along these narrow coastal zones, and we have a number of climate-sensitive sectors that we depend on. So because of this kind of vulnerability, this kind of sensitivity, it gives rise to our vulnerability as Caribbean states. And so it pervades all areas of Caribbean life. We also note that it's expanding. Our vulnerability expands as the climate continues to change, and it's threatening what we term our future sustainability because much of our livelihoods are climate dependent. So I'm a member of the Climate Studies Group Mona here at the University of the West Indies Mona campus in Jamaica. We were formed in 1994, so this predates me. We explore Caribbean climate and ocean and atmospheric influences that help to modulate the climate, and we look at climate change. Some of the things we try to do is we try to understand what are the mechanisms driving our climate, the mean, the extreme climate. We try to understand how the climate has already changed, so we look at observation data sets, and we try to understand how the climate will continue to change, and so we look at models and model projections. Important to us as well is what are the impacts of this changing climate on our lives. And we also try to develop tools that will enable anybody to better understand how the climate of our region is changing and how we respond. So I'm going to look at 3 of the projects that we have underway within our region. And the first one I'd like to look at is with respect to changes in extreme rainfall and temperature across the region. So our aim was to explore trends that we already observe in extreme climate across the region. Our data sets are 51 weather stations across different areas of the region,
And so this publication would have been informed by partnerships across meteorological services across the region. And we looked at 2 time periods, 1986 to 2010, and we also looked at 1961 to 2010. And we looked at 2 different periods because we're also constrained by data availability. We would have checked the quality of the data sets using a number of software available, and then we would have calculated a number of extreme indices to help us understand how the Caribbean climate has been changing. So I want to just give us a synopsis of some of the things that would have emerged from that work. So we were able to look at the frequency, the trends in frequency in the warm days that we have between 1961 and 2010 versus 1986 and 2010. So our maps are showing red triangles. Solid triangles tell us that the trends that we see are statistically significant. The red is showing us increases versus blue decreases. And so when we start looking at warm days and warm nights and trends in these across our region, some things that emerge for us is that we're seeing increases in the frequency of warm days and warm nights. The magnitude of the increases are up to 1 degree. So for our warmest days and nights, we're up to 1 degree warmer over the periods that have been investigated. And what we notice is the 1986 to 2010 shows an increased frequency in comparison to previous periods. And so if you look at the graph as well, you notice that the slope is also increasing. That is to say, the rate at which we're changing is increasing. We're seeing pretty much the same with respect to warm nights that we see in that bottom panel. What we also were able to do is look at extremes with respect to rainfall. And so for rainfall, trends are not as distinctive. We did not obtain any annual trends, did not observe annual trends in our annual rainfall. We didn't see any trends with respect to our average daily rainfall intensity, and no trends with respect to consecutive dry day events. So these are dry spells. What we did note, though, was a significant increase in extreme rainfall events since about the 1990s. So when we do get the rainfall, it tends to be in a lot more heavy downpour. So in summary here for this project, we had robust trends with respect to warming in our mean and extreme daily, maximum and minimum temperatures. The frequency and the magnitudes of the warming has been increasing, and there has been a decrease in the number and the temperature of very cool days and cool nights. For rainfall, we didn't observe long-term changes, though the models project that we're going to have these increases in the future, increases in extreme precipitation and longer dry spells. But what did emerge significantly is a rising trend in extreme rainfall since 1990. Second project I'd love to speak to is we can look at previous trends within our rainfall and temperature, and then we try to understand how will this change in the future. So we look at future projections of Caribbean climate using statistical downscaling approaches. So as a group, we've used multiple approaches. I want to speak this afternoon to the statistical approach. So here our aim is to generate high resolution projections of our climate, doing it for some future slices and doing it at point locations. So we can start speaking to Kingston, Jamaica, for example. And so we're using a statistical methodology that is taking relationships that we have in large scale variables and extracting from these information about rainfall and temperature at particular locations in our region. We're using a model we call statistical downscaling model. It's readily available. The statistical downscaling approach is underutilized for our region. We are constrained by data availability, so the approach becomes attractive to us, and this approach has low computational demand and is free. As we looked at future projections at these point scale locations across the region, we looked at 21 countries and locations within these 21 countries. We're looking at maximum and minimum temperature, and we also did the study for rainfall. And something we did was we divided the Caribbean and where these stations are located in 6 rainfall zones. And so we were able, by zones, able to speak to, for example, the average number of warm days we see each month, and how well the statistical model we created was able to capture this variability. And so on screen, you will see the red line showing you what the model produced versus the blue, what the observation, the station data set showed. And so the models did a generally pretty good job with respect to representing the variations we see on average by month. But we noticed that there are some zones where we have some underestimations with respect to the number of days that could be characterized as warm days. So we would calibrate, we would validate the models, and then being satisfied that the models are doing a reasonably good job in capturing the observed variability, we would then project. And so in the top panel, you would see projections with respect to warm days and warm nights. A2 speaks to a higher emissions storyline versus B2 a lower emissions. And in the bottom panel, we look at cool days and cool nights. And so something we hope you're capturing from this slide is the red shows increasing. Projections suggest that we're going to continue increasing in the frequency of warm days across our region and warm nights. And if you look at the red for the warm nights, it's stronger to suggest that the warming we see with warm nights are more intense than what we see with respect to in the daytime. For the cool days and the cool nights, we're seeing a decrease. The summer of it is we're getting warmer as a Caribbean region. We could have looked at that in the annual, we could look at that seasonally. And again, the picture is as a region, we are getting warmer. So the models produced, statistical models that we created using this software, the statistical downscaling model, produced models that did a pretty good job in representing the monthly variations. Our cool day and cool night frequencies were represented very well with some biases. And when we looked at the projections, we were seeing increases in the number of warm days and nights, but decreases are expected with respect to cool days and nights, whether for a higher emissions scenario, that is, we put more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere versus a lower emissions. We constrain how much fossil fuels we burn. And the last thing I would note here is that your warm nights are increasing more rapidly and are projected to increase more rapidly than warm days. I would then wrap up my presentation by looking at, so we have talked about climate change we've already observed. We've talked about climate change that we can project using multiple approaches. I've spoken to a statistical approach. And the last thing I would like to highlight is looking at the impacts of the changing climate for us. And that's crucial for us. Our water, tourism, agriculture are all dependent on climate. One of the studies we did was trying to characterize bushfire occurrences for Jamaica, and we used two kinds of data sets. We had some data from our Jamaica Fire Brigade, but it was insufficient. So we also tested how that data compared with, or how satellite data compared with data on the ground for Jamaica. So I'll just highlight a few things. We tried to characterize, and we characterized bushfire variability that was observed between 2001 and 2019. We used two data sets, your satellite data for that longer period versus monthly data that we had from our fire services in Jamaica. We looked at annual variability, we looked at seasonal variability. We looked at a number of methodologies to understand how bushfires have been varying for Jamaica. We looked at the monthly variability, we call that climatology. We looked at trends, have we been seeing any changes in the variability in our bushfires? And then we tried to understand, are there any periodicities that may be related to climate that could help us to predict bushfire variability? We also did some correlations between the fire data set and the climate data set. And I'll just close off by suggesting what were some of the things that emerged from a study such as this one. And so for Moody's, it represented up to 80% of the local variability in fires that we noted for Jamaica. We noted though that it underestimated the amount of fire by a factor of 30. So the variability is captured, but we would have to offset the biases should we try to use this data set to project future fire variability. The Moody showed us a primary peak, so an intensification of the fires that we see, particularly in the March period and in the July period. And these are periods where we typically have minimum rainfall. So we start seeing the suggestions on the relationship with climate. We noticed that there was a significant increase in bushfire occurrences, particularly for July, August, a period we call our midsummer drought period. And this trend explained up to almost 30% of the season's variability. So that trend is important to understanding what's happening in that season. We noticed that the annual trends in the eastern part of our island was statistically significant, and it was increasing. And that's important to us because that's a part of the island that's known for its heavy rainfall. So if we have increases in fire occurrences, it may suggest that there's a drying trend that's emerging on the east. And we did see some periodicities in fire variability in particular seasons that may have a climate linkage and is worthy of further investigation. And the final thing we noticed is that we could associate some of the variability we see at the local level with what's happening in our atmosphere at the macro Atlantic Pacific variability level. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you so much for listening to this talk on Caribbean climate variability and change, the UWI-MONA experience.
Thank you so much, Professor Stevenson. The Caribbean region over the past 2 decades has experienced more adverse weather conditions. What are some of the ways in which the region can respond to the effects of climate change?
So beautiful. We have talked about how it has changed, the impacts on us. So important to the dialogue is how we respond. And we tend to talk about 3 things, colleagues. We tend to talk about mitigation. That just says how we can reduce how much greenhouse gases we put in the atmosphere. You'll know from Prof. Mona's presentation, the mangrove treatment, restoration is important to that kind of initiative. How we treat energy efficiency or use of renewable energy becomes important. How we manage our own use of energy demand side becomes important, mitigation. We also speak to adaptation. We are already committed to some kind of climate change. How do we position ourselves as a region to minimize the negative impacts on us? And so you talk about water harvesting. You talk about taking care of our biodiversity, as you heard in earlier talks. You talk about restoration of forests and protection of forests, planting more drought-resistant crops. All of these are measures that also help us to decrease our risks to the changing climate. And then education becomes important, and forums such as these help us to raise the awareness of the importance of responding to this changing climate and responding promptly so that we can minimize the change that will happen in the future and minimize the impact on all of us.
I thank you for that, Professor Stevenson. We have time for just one question, and that question has been posed to Yoselin. What is the mechanism of communication among plants, and what kind of probing signal do they use for that communication?
Yes, thank you very much, whoever that posted that question. So plants communicate not only between cells, which is what we primarily study, but also through their roots. So there is a number of volatile signals that also are transmitted between plants as signals, for example, for defense. There is a growing area of research in which are touching on the competition between roots and what are the signals that are transmitted from one plant to the other to compete for the same nutrients when they are planted very close or at longer distances. So there is a number of ways that plants are communicating. And these signals has been studying right now. Some of them are hormones, some of them are volatiles, such as jasmonates and ethylene. So there are volatiles that are involved. And recently, I saw in a paper that was published about how plants cry. So they actually created a machine to actually detect the sounds that plants make when they are under attack. And that was published really recently in Science. And I think that we discover every day more and more about how plants can communicate between them.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, what an afternoon, what an evening. I indicated at the beginning of the seminar that there was so much academic bounty to digest, and indeed we have seen so much this afternoon and heard a lot. I trust that you agree as we have moved from a discussion on responding to the needs of vulnerable and marginalized communities, research in intercellular communication in plants with potential to impact food security and ameliorate effects of climate change, to researching indigenous women empowerment in sub-Saharan Africa, and on to gender inequality in relation to women in politics and creating awareness of gender biases, to coastal water quality as assessed by plankton, plastics, and microplastics, and to the sargassum crisis and how it may be mitigated, and on to climate change, observations, predictions, and its impact, and how the region can respond to the effects of climate change. Our time together draws to a close, but before leaving, I must thank our presenters, Professor Lisa Dion Morris, Dr. Jocelyn Benitez Alfonso, Dr. Winnie Bedigan, and Dr. Asay Appel, Professor Mona Weber, and Professor Tanisha Stevenson. Ladies, we thank you for your engaging talks and for giving us small bites of your research interest to whet our appetites for more. Thanks to our collaborators, the University of Leeds, the University of Sheffield, the Black Female Academics Network, the UII-TV, and those working behind the scenes to ensure that this seminar became a reality. Thanks to you, the members of our audience, for spending the last couple of hours with us. I remind you that this is part one. We look forward to your support for part two in the lecture series, Let the Research Speak for Itself. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all. Good evening and good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.